All right, so I want to start this message with a show of hands. How many of you read the book of Numbers recently? Okay, I don't see that hand. I don't see that one. There's not one over there. No. Okay, just what I figured. Actually, I had not read the book of Numbers in quite a while myself. It's not one of the books in the Bible that I think about a whole lot, and I had some vague idea of what was there. But lately, I've been thinking about how much our experience these days, this crazy pandemic time that we're in, and it's confusing, and there's a lot of conflicting thoughts and ideas and emotions, how it's like the book of Numbers in a way. Because you know what the book of Numbers is about? It's about journeying through a wilderness. And so when you think of wilderness, maybe you're like me. I'm an Oregonian, and I grew up around some wilderness, and there's trees and more trees, and there's streams and mountains and underbrush and lots of green. Well, when you go to the land of the Bible, the wilderness is a whole other thing. It's kind of like, I remember someone describing Kansas. They said, in Kansas, you can look farther and see less than anywhere else in the country. Now, I don't know if that's fair to Kansas, but I think they were from Kansas, and they told me that. Anyway, that's more like the land of the Bible. It's a dry desert land. The throat is parched, the lips are cracked, and you still to this day see people carrying jars of water on their head to get from one place to the other, looking for shade along the way. The wilderness that Numbers deals with is that area of Shur, Paran, Kadesh Barnea, Edom. And there's a surprise, though, when you see the wilderness that the Bible describes. Because tucked in and around the wilderness are lush, fertile areas. There is the lush valley up around the Galilee, where you will find produce. You will find avocados and bananas. You'll find oranges in the area of Jericho and vineyards in the Jezreel Valley. Truly, this is a land of milk and honey, so to speak. So, the books of Moses, they're called, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the law, the Torah, as the Jews would call it. Right there in these books is Genesis and Exodus. Remember Exodus, Moses leads the people out of slavery towards the promised land of Canaan, okay? So Exodus, Leviticus, and then Numbers, the book we're looking at today. Numbers is the story of the journey of those Israelite people through the wilderness to get to the promised land. So I think we can relate to the book of Numbers that we hardly ever read. We can relate because not only during a pandemic, but during other times in our lives, we realize we're in a wilderness. Maybe we're full of fear. Maybe we're full of doubt. Maybe there are challenges coming every which way. And we wonder what's next. That's a wilderness experience. And the experience of the Israelite nation and the experience of us really parallels in a lot of ways as you read your scripture. Now, what's going on in the background behind chapter 14 as it was read to you a while ago? Well, in chapter 13 of Numbers, Moses sends out spies to go on up to the promised land, to Canaan, and to check it out, see what it's like. So he sends up a bunch of guys, and they're supposed to check and see, is it a fertile land? Is there fruit there? What are the cities like? What are the people like? Are the cities walled? Are they fortified or not? Are the people mighty or weak? What is this place like? And so they come back with a report. Now, they did say it is indeed a land flowing with milk and honey. There's a lot of promise there. We can see this would be a wonderful place that the Lord has promised. But the people there, their cities are strong and big and fortified. The people there are huge and mighty, and we're a bunch of scrawny wanderers. You know, it took them 40 years, by the way, to get about 200 miles. They zigged and they zagged, but that's the nature of wilderness, isn't it? You don't go straight through very, very often and quickly get to the promised land. We zig and we zag, and there's delays, and there's problems, and they had the Ammonites and the Amorites and the mosquito bites, and they had all kinds of problems, okay, everywhere they turned, and it took a long time to get there. But the wilderness, it can be a scary time, and so the people were scared, and they said, oh no, we're not going to go there. These spies are telling us that the people are mighty there, and this is too scary. We'll be wiped out. And one of the spies, Caleb, he said, well, the Lord is leading us, and we're going to be okay. Let's go there. It'll work out. Let's journey forward. But the people said, are you kidding? We're hearing reports that the people there are so mighty, and it makes us look like grasshoppers. That's what it says at the end of chapter 13. They were so scared of being grasshoppers among giants. Well, that was a frightening time for them, and the critical question in chapter 14 of Numbers is, are they just going to turn and go back to Egypt? They even said, Moses, Aaron, we want to go back. If they kill us there in Egypt, we're better off than going forward and meeting the swords of these people in this new land. It's better if we died here in the wilderness than go forward into this new land, a new life. They were truly frightened and wanting to go the opposite direction. And that's always the temptation, isn't it, in a wilderness time in our lives. Do we move forward? Do we trust God, or do we move back? Now, one of our disciple ministers years ago wrote a very fine book about books of the Bible, and it's called Books That Bring Life, and his name is Eugene Bryce. Eugene Bryce points out that the book of Numbers touches on a universal theme because many of us find that we spend much more time in the wilderness of life than we do in the promised land. Consider then the book of Numbers, the lessons learned from the wilderness. And the first lesson, he says, is the wilderness is inevitable. Every promised land is bordered by wilderness. Indeed, we must go through the wilderness to get to the land of milk and honey, so to speak. School, for instance, Eugene Bryce says, the long wilderness of college and graduate degree must be endured before the profession can be entered. The long hours of practicing the instrument must be endured before the recital can be played. The drudgerous days of training when there's no one there to cheer must be endured before the championship can be won. Even Bible study has its wilderness when we're confronted with issues that we have no easy resolutions, and it requires hard thought. The closer we get to the light, the more shadows are cast, and this sometimes comes as a surprise to us when we think the study of the Bible should be all promised land. In so many ways, the only route to the promised land runs through the wilderness, and Numbers reminds us of this. And I think it's true in relationships as well. Even in the best of relationship, of a friendship or a marriage, there are times of frustration, times of just seemingly going in different paths, different directions, and you pull and tug, and there's wilderness experience, even in a really good relationship. Things can really break down between people sometimes. And how do people get past the anger, the coldness, the things that come between us? Well, there's wilderness for a while, isn't there? There's that wilderness of loneliness maybe, or distrust, or even of guilt. But then we come out at courage, and we come out at forgiveness and reuniting. The wilderness in relationships is very real, but there is a promised land there if we move forward. Judith Viorst wrote a very cute poem about a kid who is struggling with apologizing to someone. It's hard to say, "I'm sorry," although I'm feeling sorry. The S always sticks in my throat, and "I made a big mistake" would produce a bellyache that might last until I was old enough to vote. "Please forgive me" sounds real good, and I'd say it if I could. But between the forgive and the please, I would have to go to bed with a pounding in my head and a very shaky feeling in my knees. "I was wrong" seems oh so right, but it gives me such a fright that my was always turns into ain't. So I hope you'll take this rhyme as my way of saying I'm really sorry. Now excuse me while I faint. The wilderness in relationships, in every arena of life, it's just an inevitable part of living. Second lesson from Numbers, the wilderness can be very discouraging. The daily struggle in our own wilderness can depress us or demoralize us. It can threaten to defeat us. Moses sent those spies to scout out the promised land, and most of the spies, they brought back a very discouraging report. You know, compared to the LeBron Jameses of what's over there in that land, we're like a bunch of Minnie Mouses with sandals. Or like, you know, I always wonder what those guys felt like in the 1980 U.S. hockey team in the Olympics. Remember that? Bunch of amateurs and college guys on that team taking on the mighty Soviet hockey machine. What were they thinking going into that game? Or I always think about skinny little Danny, wasn't his name Daniel LaRusso, otherwise known as the Karate Kid, right? And he's in the All-City Championship, and his knee is injured, and he's just a skinny kid against that big bully Johnny. What's he thinking going in there? So the Israelite people, as they were in that position, they said, "No, forget it. We give up. Let's go back to Egypt. Let's go back." And we say, let's forget it when that cranky neighbor that we're trying to bring love, we're trying to bring God's love to them, and it's not working, and we just say, too hard, forget it, I'm going to pretend I don't care. Or helping that person who's a little bit desperate right now, who's going through a crazy time, maybe homeless. That's too overwhelming. What can I do? Go back to not noticing. Spiritual growth, maturity in faith, not me, can't happen. Better to go back to Egypt. Better go back and coast along spiritually. Let other people deep dive into Scripture and prayer and into living by the Spirit. You see, the wilderness can be very discouraging, and we want to pull back. And we forget, don't we, what Caleb said to the people. He said, "No, wait a minute. we're with God and God is with us, and we can do this thing. I heard an interview on television a month or two ago on the show 60 Minutes. Maybe you saw it. And they were talking to survivors of the Holocaust. And they interviewed one man named Aaron Elster, an old man now, who was a Holocaust survivor, and he explained that as the Jews were being rounded up in his town's marketplace, his father told him to run. He was just 9 years old, and he crawled in the sewer ditch until he was out of sight, and then he stood up and he ran. And he came eventually to the home of the Gurskis, an older Polish couple who he knew because they sometimes came to his parents' butcher shop. He begged them to take him into their home. And they said no at first. They said, "No, we can't do that. That's too big a risk." The boy cried. They finally said, "Well, you can stay upstairs." And they let him go upstairs in the attic. And that 9-year-old boy, Aaron, lived in that attic for almost 2 years. You talk about a quarantine. Once a day, the Gurskis would bring upstairs some food and check on him each day. And they let him stay there throughout that whole time until it was safe to come out. He experienced hunger and fear and great loneliness. What do you do alone all day, every day? He said, "I used to catch flies, take off their wings so they wouldn't leave me." He said, "I survived with daydreams. I wrote a novel in my head and I was the hero. I tried to keep my mind active." And as he's saying all this, I was thinking, also, you survived because of the Gurskis. You survived, Aaron, because here was this older couple who brought a bit of food, a bit of compassion, a bit of humanity into your day each day. God, as it turns out, works through people, regular, ordinary people. Caleb said to the Israelite people, "The Lord is with us, and we can do this thing." The Lord is with us. The third lesson that I think is important to hear today is the wilderness can be very valuable. Bryce says the wilderness was the furnace that forged a strong, unified group of people and then left them poised on the edge of the promised land that they had so long desired. It made a hero out of Moses and a people out of Israel. We don't like much of the things we find in a wilderness, but it makes us who we are. Our character as individuals, and our character as a church family, and our character as a community. Sue Monk Kidd, in her book, When the Heart Waits, speaks of this journey we're all on towards home. Hope lies in braving the deserts, of going into those places of fear and dread, of finding and claiming our truth, and watching and waiting for healing, then bravely walking through the desert to claim our new home. Through our journey of waiting, we come home to live out a new, more expansive, more authentic vision of who we are. She writes, to believe that you can find your way home through the crisis and suffering that fall upon you, and believe it even in the midnight of your struggle, requires a transfigured vision. It requires faith. I find something breathtakingly hallowed about this truth, that in the midst of pain and crisis, God is drawing us to wholeness. I found a song by Don Eaton, and I want to close with the words from this very special song. Sometimes I get so full of feelings, I'm afraid I might go crazy. And I wonder how I have survived at all. All the trash, all the treasure, all the pain, all the pleasure come crashing down upon me like a sacred waterfall. Still, this courageous heart keeps celebrating living, so whole and so together, so broken and alone. And I don't know what the future holds, but I know who holds the future. And that's why we keep on loving, because that's how we get back home. Amen.